Okay, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started while people are coming in and also joining in online. So welcome to the Great Lakes Seminar Series, co-sponsored by the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research, SIGLR, and the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, GLERL. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Silvia Newell. Silvia did her undergraduate work at Smith College in Massachusetts. She then went on to graduate school at Princeton University, where she did her master's and PhD with Bess Ward, who's a really leading microbial ecologist and biogeochemist and biological oceanographer, especially in nitrogen cycling in the oceans, which is what Silvia worked on there. She also did a postdoc at Princeton, which at least had a strong educational component, if not focused on education, and then another postdoc at Boston University as an NSF postdoctoral fellow. Then in 2014, she started her first tenure track faculty position at Wright State University, where she started doing more and more work in freshwater systems and eutrophication and nutrient cycling in freshwaters, though she still works in the oceans. And then last year, we're really thrilled that she joined us at the University of Michigan as a full professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability and the director of the Michigan Sea Grant. So we're really excited to have her here today to get to know all of you, for you to get to know her, and for us to think about how Sea Grant and SIGLR and GLERL can interact and work together. So today she's going to talk about her work on H2Ohio Wetland Monitoring. Welcome, Silvia.
Thank you. I want to take a moment to acknowledge how impressed I am that Greg did all of that without reading it off of anything. All right, so today is sort of a nice continuation of the theme that we had last week with Bill Curry. And in fact, we're at the moment trying to get funding to apply Bill's model from last week to many of the H2Ohio wetlands that we'll be talking about today. Okay, so if you don't know what H2Ohio is, it was an initiative, a bill that was passed in the state of Ohio to try to reduce nutrient pollution and therefore the size of harmful algal blooms, largely in Lake Erie, although it ended up being a statewide program. And considering there are also harmful algal blooms in the Ohio River, that seemed like a pretty good idea. And there are a lot of components to H2Ohio that include engagement with farmers, having farmers enact certain management practices, the purchase of really large equipment that farmers can rent and use. And a really small part of that arm is wetlands. But it is an important piece in here, is the building of wetlands. And this is 115, I think they're now up to like 174 different projects around the state of Ohio. And two of the ones I'm going to talk about today, one of them was one of the very first projects. So things that were sort of shovel ready got priority at the beginning. But one of the really nice things that the state of Ohio did, and I do believe is actually a leader in this across the country, is they initiated a monitoring program at the same time. So the idea was, if we're going to sink all of this money into wetlands, and specifically as a tool for nutrient reduction, we also need to monitor them at the same time to make sure that they're actually working for the purpose that we're funding them for. And then also to evaluate if there are certain types of wetlands that work better or worse, or what are the lessons that we can learn from the first few round of projects to inform decisions going down the line. Because not all wetlands are created equally for nutrient reduction, right? Some are great for biodiversity and habitat, really good for birds. Some are great for, flood mitigation and prevention. In fact, a lot of them are. And while that's not something that we're really evaluating at this moment as part of this program, it's something that came up at our workshop last week, and something that some of you in this room might be really good at, and maybe we should talk about, is how to consider these wetlands in terms of water storage capacity and flood mitigation, because that's also a really important aspect of what wetlands can do. It was just sort of outside of the scope of the law around H2Ohio for nutrient reduction specifically. So keep that in mind as we're going through, because we do have, as you can see up here, a lot of coastal wetlands, and some of those coastal wetlands, like I said, might have other things that they're good at, like flood mitigation. So our monitoring team was initiated at the beginning, and it involves 6 different universities across the state of Ohio. and a lot of different expertise, both in nutrients, but also we tried not to limit it to just nutrient biogeochemists. We thought that, say, plants were a really important thing in wetlands for taking up nutrients and how that might be achieved. And soil scientists, especially people interested in looking at different ways that phosphorus binds in soil and sediments and might also be released, right? As well as the ability to do this down the line and model it. So Ganming Liu at Bowling Green State University is attempting to build models for as many of the wetlands as humanly possible, but you know, it's a lot of work. And as the nitrogen person, I will talk a little bit today about some of the work that we did trying to look at other parts of the nitrogen cycle other than just nutrients in and nutrients out, but ways that nitrogen is removed within the wetlands, and specifically talking about denitrification today, although we have looked at other of the nitrogen cycling pathways as well. We've got a lot of different kinds of wetlands that got funded through this initiative. Some of them are much easier hydrodynamically to figure out and calculate how much water is going through, is being stored, what the residence time is, etc. And some of them are very difficult to work with, and we are still trying to figure out what's the best way to handle that. And we've got a lot of sensors being deployed and a lot of model application that's hopefully going to help with that. But for the purpose of today, I'm mostly focusing on two wetlands that are mainly flood through, although one of them is the world's smallest and most complicated wetland, and decided to also be a coastal wetland that sort of the lake level comes back and inundates the wetland and makes everything more complicated. So keep in mind that anything I show you about that is super preliminary while we're still trying to build up the water data to get the hydrodynamic model more informed and calibrated. Right, so the first one I'm going to talk to you about today, this one is Buckeye Lake wetland. So Buckeye Lake is just southeast of Columbus in Ohio, and it is, I don't know why it's auto-playing and I don't know how to make it stop. Anyway, it is bright green through a good chunk of the year, has a nice microcystis problem, and it is like almost all other lakes in the state of Ohio, not a real lake. It has a water control structure on the end of it, is technically a reservoir, and the level of water in the lake can vary drastically based on literal control of, control structures in the water. So this itty bitty tiny wetland down here, which I'll show you, the watershed is 1.2 square miles. The entire wetland is, I want to say, if you cut this room in half and stacked it back to back on each other, that's about the size of the wetland. It's pretty small. And the design plans, the whole thing was initially a parking lot, if that gives you an idea about the scale, and they basically got rid of most of the parking lot and then put a nice little side wetland over here. But what happens is the water comes in from this bottom corner of the page, and there's a little choke point here because there's a bridge over it, which is actually super nice in terms of the geometry of the wetland channel, which I'll talk about in a second. But so we have the inflow down here. We thought we had what would be the outflow down here by this boat dock. Turns out that's just the lake backing up. And so our outflow, we end up considering somewhere between the middle and the end, depending on what the lake level is. And that's one of the reasons that make it hard to figure out flow and nutrient reduction rate, because if you're trying to look for your in and your out, but where your out is keeps changing. So we're doing the best we can with the estimates that we got, but we're hoping that the hydrodynamic model and increased data will help us figure this out. But there's also this weird little side wetland over here where the water literally gets pumped out of this main pool into this side part, and then it flows back in through this culvert underneath the road that goes to the parking lot. And so there's a small amount of water, but it's like 20 gallons a minute. It's really low. So there's a small amount of water that goes through this side pool, but it's also a little hard to know what to do with that. So to kit this out and figure out what's going on here, we put out some hobo sensors. So hobo data loggers looking at lake level. We put out some exosondes, and we'll show you some of the data from that to measure really basic parameters, because things like turbidity and conductivity help us figure out where the water is coming from, whether it's coming from the itty bitty tiny creek that flows into it called Murphy's Run, which is super flashy, or whether it's representative of the lake backing up. And that happens a lot. So We also then put in an AV sensor. It's the Sontech side looker. And this is where I was mentioning that the channel shape is really important because under the bridge, there are very defined walls, right? And so we can actually have pretty good confidence of the volume of water going under that bridge and which direction it's flowing. That's the thing about the AV sensors, it's bidirectional, so you can look at the flow either way. Unfortunately, the one they sent us was kind of a lemon, and we only ended up getting 2.5 months of data out of a year. So everything I'm showing you is based on that. So we're hoping that with the new one that they sent us, we'll get a good full year of data and be able to better, be more confident in the relationship that we have for water right now. Because until we do that, we have to rely on some watershed weighting, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But basically, we have had a tech who would go out every 2 to 3 weeks. And it's not an insignificant drive from Wright State. It's a long day to drive out there and drive back. It's like basically across the state of Ohio. And so, yeah, it's a long day. And so it's logistically challenging to go out there. And so having sensors that can be deployed and stay there were a really critical part of trying to measure flow over time. And so we'd love to be able to do that for the nutrients as well instead of an auto sampler. But these things all take time when you have a brand new program to set up, and we're really only a couple of years into it. So I think the fact that we have this much data is actually kind of impressive so far. So for the first year before we had the AV sensor, we just went out with a flow meter, and every time we measured flow, we'd write it down. And so what we could do then is look at the nearest tiny river going into Buckeye Lake and do watershed weighting. So basically you take the amount of water going through that and take the fraction of the size of the watershed for Murphy's Run, which again is 1.2 square miles, and it's essentially 1/47th of the South Licking River. And so we came up with an estimate of discharge based on that, and then we tried to compare that with our field measurements and make sure that they lined up, and they do line up pretty well. But that's not really the world's best way to verify it either. So when we got the AV sensor, we looked at the flow from the AV sensor and compared that to what we got from the watershed weighting. And the slope on this line ends up being about 1.75. Hopefully when we have a lot more data, we'll be more confident in that number. But I don't see it changing a whole lot. It might be up to 2 something or, down to 1.2, but I think we're in the right ballpark here. And so these data that I'm showing you today are all based on this relationship between the AV sensor flow and the watershed weighting. And that's why they're estimates, because we need more data to be more confident in it. But I think it's a good exercise to walk through, likely what this will be, and it just has sort of larger uncertainty around it. So of our stations here, right, we have essentially inflow from Murphy's Run is number 1. The lake is basically number 4, and everything 1, 2, 5, and 6 is now not on here. And showing how water changes as it's moving through the wetland. And so this is stuff we got from the exosonde, pH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, temperature. That turns out to actually be rather important because the conductivity particularly can be really different between the river and the lake, and it can help us figure out where the outflow is or should be considered to be in while we were waiting for the model and hobo level data to talk to us about it. We also look at total nitrogen, total phosphorus, SRP, NOx, and urea and ammonia are part of our program, but we are not including them on here. And what's good to see is that the inflow on most of these, the blue line, is often the highest, which is what we'd like to see, right? Is that the concentration is the highest coming in, and then it gets diluted as you move through the wetland. But that's not always true at every point, and sometimes the lake, as you can see here, this purple line is higher than everything else, and so that means when the lake is backflowing into the wetland, it's essentially getting diluted by the wetland water, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what that means about nutrient reduction, right? And I have some thoughts about that I'll share with you in a minute. I wish I could show you this graph, but it didn't show up, so basically, I might as well, I think I'm just going to skip this and move to here. So forgive me for all the numbers being thrown at you here, but I just sort of want to walk through what we're doing. We're basically taking the concentration that we're measuring every other week and multiplying that by the total load of water going through in that time period, assuming that if you've got, 100 pounds of wouldn't be pounds, and this 100 grams of nitrogen coming in, over a given time period, and you've only got 50 going out, right? Then that's a reduction of 50 over whatever given time period it is. And we decided actually that looking at average concentrations over seasons might be a good way to look at this. We're still trying to figure out what's the best, but given that the concentrations at any given point in time 2 weeks apart might not be the most accurate, to give a better sense of the uncertainty around that, looking at the average and standard, well, uncertainty, maybe standard error, maybe standard deviation. This is standard error. Trying to think about what that's likely to be over a long period of time with similar, hydrodynamic patterns. So within a season, and it turns out that the seasons on the calendar actually work relatively well with water, right? You got pretty low flow in summer, pretty high flow in spring, sometimes in winter. And so we ended up estimating these load changes from the wetland by that. And for 2022, we removed quite a bit of total nitrogen, notice the more than 10% error on this, right? And then the TP load change is maybe more than zero, maybe zero. I don't know, it's got a pretty big error bar on it. Sometimes basically it's a small sink, sometimes it's a small source, and overall it seems to average out to not being a great remover of total phosphorus. And I think that this has to do with the fact that the lake backfills into the wetland, because a lot of wetlands, right? You've got water coming in from a river that's carrying a lot of suspended sediment. It's really turbid. And that first settling pool that you get in a wetland, a lot of that stuff physically settles out. And so you're removing a lot of particulate phosphorus that way. When you have a lake backfilling into a wetland, it's not carrying the same kind of turbidity load in it. It's carrying a lot of phytoplankton and algae, especially Buckeye Lake in the summer, right? There's a lot of algae in it. And it basically goes in and the pea just turns over. It's not really like sinking out and settling in the way that you would like to at the same scale as that particulate phosphorus does when it comes in bound to sediment particles. And so I'm thinking at this moment, this is my best hypothesis, right, that the water from the lake makes the wetland look worse, more or less. And if you were able to separate the wetland from the lake and just look at what's coming in and settling from Murphy's Run, it would look like a pea sink, but because you have this extra phosphorus coming in the form of all this algae, that it's sort of muddying the signal. But that is one of the reasons why looking at a coastal wetland or a non-flow through wetland is much harder to make these estimates for, because it's less clear when you don't have, always a defined out, or when your out sometimes becomes an in because the water's moving the wrong direction. So overall though, I mean, it does look like it does a pretty good job for nitrogen, and it's not necessarily doing anything bad for phosphorus. So another way that we can look at that in terms of phosphorus is looking at sediment data. And so here we have total phosphorus in the different sampling parts of the wetland, and the main pool and that side pool. And our total phosphorus has actually gone up a little bit at one site and gone down a little bit at some of the others, but essentially it's still holding quite a bit of P. And then we have something called the soil phosphorus sorption capacity, which is a measure of the ions available to bind phosphorus within the sediment. And you can see that right after construction, there were actually fewer sites available. But that makes sense because there was no water in it yet either, just literally like dug out hole. And then 1 year later, you're actually getting potentially increased or the same soil phosphorus sorption capacity, which means that those binding sites are not filling up super fast. I'll show you the one that's near Grand Lake St. Mary's, and it basically significantly goes down within a year because there's so much phosphorus coming in. But that means that we still have pretty high soil phosphorus binding capacity in this wetland, which tells me that it still is a sink for P over time. And that's why I think it's the lake muddying the signal. So the other thing we did was look at denitrification, because I'm the nitrogen person, right? So we went out and took sediment cores and we incubate them in these are after the incubation. Don't judge me for all the big bubbles in them if you know anything about this. There are sediment plugs at the bottom, and it maintains the overlying water over it, so it keeps whatever oxygen gradient and other important biogeochemical gradients between the water and the sediment, and it allows that to stay intact so you don't have to spend days for all of that to settle back out, because denitrifying bacteria are facultative anaerobes, so if you disturb the oxygen gradient, they will switch to using oxygen and it'll look like there's no denitrification in your cores. So it's really important to keep that so that we can look at it. So what we do is we go out and we collect all these cores around the wetland, we seal them so they're gas tight, and we use gas tight tubing. And then we pump a bunch of water through it. We pump water that doesn't have anything added to it, and we pump water that has 15 nitrate added to it. And the idea is that if you put in 15 nitrate and you measure N2 gas that has a 15 label in it, whether it's 29 or 30 coming out, you can get an estimate of denitrification rates, or you can calculate denitrification rates. So denitrification is the reduction of nitrate all the way down to N2 gas. It also annoyingly makes a greenhouse gas called N2O as a byproduct. If you have way overloading on the nitrate, or if you're getting to the oxygen gradient where you're starting to get oxygen infiltrating into where the bacteria are, that last enzyme here, the nitrous oxide reductase, will actually shut down, and that's where you end up getting nitrous oxide released. But as long as the denitrifiers are in a thoroughly anoxic location and the nitrate load is not way too high, they're usually pretty good about full completion to N2. Just depends on where they are. It's really important though, because this is a critical ecosystem service, right? If we're going to remove nitrogen from a system, this is how you do it, is denitrification. There are some other pathways for it because the nitrogen cycle is really complicated, has a lot of arrows. I'm not including them in this talk. We measured those too. They're a pretty small portion of this. I'm happy to talk about that if it's something you're interested in. So we then measured dissolved gases in the water through something called a membrane inlet mass spec. This is the old one I had at Wright State. I now have a new one at University of Michigan that's really, really pretty, and I like all the new upgrades to it, and it doesn't bust a ball bearing when the power goes out and cost me $8 grand. So super excited. So it can measure dissolved gases. So we look at nitrogen and oxygen as dissolved gases. And so we can figure out both the sediment oxygen consumption, which is important when you're trying to figure out how fast water is going to go hypoxic, right? What's the oxygen drawdown? And because hypoxic overlying water tends to then release phosphorus from whatever it's bound to, this is pretty important in a wetland. So we were looking at how much oxygen gets consumed in milligrams per meters squared per hour. And it's actually kind of high, 20 milligrams is pretty significant amount. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And then we look at how much nitrogen is being produced. And this is without adding any nitrate. This 28N2 flux is from our control cores where we don't add anything to them. And we just see how much is coming out to begin with, more than was going in. And you can get pretty high rates of N2 here. So, up to 6 to 8 milligrams per meter squared per hour is a lot. And that's important because that total rate that we looked at for total nitrogen removed for the year, the like 3,000 pounds of nitrogen or whatever, it basically takes a pretty high rate like this for either more than half the year or, it takes a pretty high rate to be able to achieve that. So I want to say that these are completely reasonable rates because that's about how much nitrogen we see getting removed, although some of it is obviously going into plants and being held there and being stored as soil organic matter and breakdown of other things. It's not the only way nitrogen gets removed, but this rate is high enough to be in that ballpark anyway. And so you can see that that corresponds to a very similar nitrate flux in, which is important, right? Because that suggests then that we are taking up nitrogen from the water and it's going through denitrification, and you want those things to line up. What's interesting though is that sometimes the wetland is, if it's a negative bar, it's going in. If it's a positive bar, it's coming out of the sediment. That sometimes the sediments are phosphate flux out, which is not necessarily surprising. Again, if you've got really low oxygen in the overlying water, that it would be a small source of SRP here. So we do see it being a sink sometimes, but we also see it being a source sometimes. And I think, again, that balance between those two things contributes to what we're seeing, where the wetland can be both a source and a sink for phosphorus, and it sort of evens out over time. So the wetland is providing an important ecosystem service. It's got really high rates of denitrification. It's removing a lot of nitrogen. The TP load reduction is pretty small, probably because the watershed is small and the lake backs up into it and makes everything more complicated. Like I said, Dr. Gan-Ming Liu at Bowling Green State University is putting together a 3D hydrodynamic model trying to look at how the water moves from the lake to the wetland and back. And hopefully when we are able to give him better AV sensor data to calibrate and tune that model, he will be able to actually tell us how the water is moving, and we'll be able to make really accurate load reduction estimates instead of these with the really big error bars on them. But for now, you know, I'm reasonably happy with what we got. I think we're getting a good idea about what's happening. And I think that it's important to look at wetlands of all types and see how well they're working or not. And it's an interesting thing to note that something that's very small and has a lake backing up into it is going to give us less clear results potentially about its role for phosphorus reduction. So if you attended the public webinar that came out of H2Ohio in December, you will have seen my colleague Stephen Jackman give this already. Actually, I should have introduced everyone and I didn't. So I was on this as a PI at Wright State, and I've stayed on even at University of Michigan. My co-PI on the project for our project is Dr. Stephen Jackman, who's at Lake Campus at Wright State University. And the really awesome tech staff that we've had working with us, Justin Myers and Morgan, she's Morgan Udy now, have done a really, really nice job collecting all of these data. And, you know, I go out sometimes, but I don't get to go out as often as I like to anymore. The nice thing about the Grand Lake St. Mary's wetlands, though, the ones that have been installed through H2Ohio, is that there were already several treatment wetlands in place around Grand Lake since 2011, 2012, and it got a distressed watershed designation. They started putting these in around the lake, and so a lot of lessons had already been learned in that watershed about what works well for the watershed. And so Stephen was able to work with the people designing and implementing this wetland to make sure that it sort of followed a similar design to the other ones that we knew would work pretty well already. So this site is called the Burntwood-Langenkamp site. It's off of Coldwater Creek, which flows into Grand Lake St. Mary's, which flows into both the Ohio River and Lake Erie. It's a long story. And this one was at the intersection of Coldwater and Burntwood. It was a corn and soybean field for 50 years, and they ended up giving 90 acres to this project, about 45 wetland acres and half other things. It drains a much larger watershed than the Brooks Park site, about 5,700 acres. And it has a capacity to hold between 5 and 20 million gallons of water. So it can hold quite a bit of water. It's a pretty big site. You can see it sort of flooded up over here. And here's an aerial view. Here's what it looked like before they dug out the wetland from it when it was a farm field. And you can see it's got a nice sinuous pattern in here that allows the water to stay for a while. And it's we can actually control the residence time because there's a pump of water going into it in the summer. Doesn't need it in the spring, but in the summer when it would be dry otherwise, we can control going in. And then at the end of the wetland over here, there is a control structure called an agri-drain that we can drop a hobo in and measure the level of water coming out and therefore the volume of water coming out. So we have really accurate water estimates both in and out for this wetland. You can see the timeline of it here, that the land was purchased through 2020 or in 2020. The design and construction happened in 2022. Mad scientists and access engineering did a lot of that. And then we had it's up and functioning at the end of, or at the beginning of last year. And they organized a community event and planted more than 40,000 wetland plants, not just the seed throughout the wetlands. So it definitely got a kickstart on the vegetation, which might be part of why it was looking pretty good from a pretty early part. It's really helpful to have, you know, plants planted, and it's just really lovely now. So you can see there's an inflow notch over here at the bottom of the diagram, pumps into an initial settling pool. And in terms of maintenance, this is really important because having that settling pool, there's a road that comes over here, really accessible, close to a road. So if we are looking at this wetland, monitoring it, and we see that the P binding sites are filling up, that it's starting to be likely to become a P source instead of a P sink. Stephen has been doing this or working with the local groups to do this maintenance on a lot of the other wetlands there, where they'll literally go in and dredge it out. And so that gives us, you know, time to sort of start over with P binding in that initial settling pool, and it makes the wetland stay a P source or a P sink for much longer, which is awesome. So you can see the flow comes through here. Again, there's this choke point between the initial settling pool and the other settling pool, which is great because again, we were able to put an AV sensor, and it's essentially a really large culvert, and actually measure the flow in and then develop a rating curve between the water level and the amount of water going through, so that we would be able to estimate that just from a hobo down the line, calculate it. And so we have pretty good measurements of the water going in, the water going out, and we know the volume of the wetland at any given level, right? So we can measure the residence time. We also go out and sample weekly for nutrients, and there are also the same exosons out there, so we get that basic physical chemical parameters as well. And Ganming has been helping us figure out where to put groundwater wells as well. And there's a geophysicist, Kennedy Doro, also. Oh man, I think it's University of Toledo, not BG. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. Anyway, and they've been going out and drilling some of the wells. And so we're getting a good idea of other exchange into the wetland as well. And that will go into the model when one gets made for Burntwood. But as it stands, because we have water in and water out, we have a pretty good idea of both the creek, but then also how much of the creek is being treated by this wetland. So we can have percent of water served, and it's on about 0.75% of the land in the watershed, but it captures about 4% of the water volume, which is pretty impressive, actually. In 2022, we had a really dry year, right? And the inflow pump was only on for about a month in the summer. But in 2023, we had more water coming in. It was a wetter year, and the pump was on for about 1.5 months in the summer. And we literally have to turn it off and turn it on, right? So we have control over when the water is being pumped, and we have accurate information about when that started, when that ended. And so again, that gives us good volume data. So we measure both dissolved inorganic nitrogen and total nitrogen, and SRP and TP. And if you look at the creek versus the wetland, you can see that the creek concentrations are almost always higher in the inflow than they are in the outflow of the wetland. They are reduced by an average of about 14%, with more reduction happening in the summer, which is, yeah, good. Same thing with TP. Also look at NOx and total nitrogen. And again, the NOx is really high differences, right? So we're assuming, although I don't think we actually analyzed the core data yet, we did go out and do sediment cores for Burntwood as well. And I anticipate seeing pretty high levels of denitrification in winter and spring, although maybe not quite as much in summer, which would make sense because the nitrate inflow is going to be a lot lower then. And same thing with TN, just see a lot of reduction of nitrogen. The dissolved concentrations about up to 90% different, with an average of 69% difference between the inflow and outflow, even in the winter, which I want to point out is pretty incredible, because how do wetlands reduce nutrients, right? You have a settling pool and plants, and that the plants are not doing a whole lot in the winter. So just the fact that there's time, it's slowed down, you have still microbes doing their thing. I mean, denitrifiers, if it's not frozen, they're still working. And that settling pool and the combination of those things allows the wetland to still provide some ecosystem services even in the winter, which is, I think, pretty awesome to see. And so we're able to do nutrient load reductions by season again, and it's, again, easier when you actually know the water in and water out times change in concentration, right? And so you can see that in terms of, this is kilograms, not pounds, but there's a lot of nitrogen reduction, again, about 2,600 kilograms of nitrogen, about 15 of total phosphorus. And that was just from 2023. So we'll have to see how it does under different types of water years as we're going forward, but it's really promising that it seems to be working pretty well. All right, so to give you an idea again of this soil phosphorus sorption capacity in the soils for Burntwood in the same way that we did it, notice that down here pre-construction, there was no soil phosphorus sorption capacity. This was a farm field, and we went out and plugged it before they even broke ground. And yeah, there was basically no P binding sites left. So they went in and they essentially took out a lot of the topsoil, dug down and then once you put the water in it, right, will interact with certain compounds. And we ended up with a pretty decent soil phosphorus absorption capacity to start with, but there's already a pretty strong drop in the first year, and we'll keep monitoring it. But that's why, especially around Grand Lake, I mean, remember, I don't know, maybe you don't know this, but around Grand Lake, the concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus are in the 90th percentile of how high they are for the entire country. So there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus that comes in. It's just very high concentrations. And so the fact that, my colleague knew this and was able to make sure that for this site, the maintenance would be easy. It's close to a road access. You can go and actually dig out that settling pond and make it continue to be a P-sink, I think makes it really valuable as a nutrient management tool. So I would like to take that note then to emphasize that continued monitoring in all of these wetlands is really important, because they're going to function at different speeds in terms of how fast those P binding sites fill up, how the vegetation behaves, how it changes over time, and how all of those things are going to influence the biogeochemistry of the wetland and how well they work as nutrient reduction tools. If that's what we're using them for, then I think it's really awesome that this program is funding the monitoring arm of this to be able to continue to look at that and give that information to whomever is managing the wetlands, so they have information to make these really critical decisions. So that's it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, so we welcome questions both from the room here as well as online. If you're online, please feel free to type questions in the chat.
So it sounded like with the Grand Lake St. Mary's, some of those wetlands have been around for a while. Oh, sorry.
So with the Grand Lake St. Mary's, it sounds like some of those wetlands have been around since 2011. Is that correct?
2012, I think, is the oldest one, and then 2013 or 2014. They're not part of the H2Ohio Monitoring Program, but because my colleague has been the one monitoring them, he was able to take some of the lessons learned from that.
So my question is, with, I guess, whether it's Grand Lake St. Mary's or any of these other wetlands that have been implemented by H2Ohio, which they're more recent, but have you seen any response in the lake yet with the construction of these wetlands in terms of nutrient reduction?
So for Grand Lake St. Mary's, the wetlands are one of many tools that are being used once it got the distressed watershed designation. There were a lot of ruling around, so the Ohio now has a statewide manure ban from December 15th to March 15th, but that was instituted earlier in Grand Lake St. Mary's, along with some management practices like required soil P testing, and you can only add as much fertilizer as the corn you're growing can take up, and manure storage sheds in addition to the wetlands. And we are seeing a change in Grand Lake St. Mary's. Everything is down, I want to say roughly about 10 to 15% from where it was a decade ago. And considering all those things take time to ramp up and get implemented, I'm hoping that it will be a faster rate as time goes on. So we are seeing changes. I can't parse out how much of it is, a few wetlands, but I'm hoping that as more wetlands go in, that will sort of exponentially drive that drop down process. But for the rest of the state, no, they're only a couple of years old, so we can't really evaluate any impact they might be having it, and it might not even really be able to be measured at this point yet.
Thanks, Silvia, for a nice presentation. I have a more general question. When the new phosphorus targets were adopted for Lake Erie in 2017, a couple of the jurisdictions jumped up and said, "Oh, we're going to be halfway there by I think they said 2022 or something like that." That was probably a mistake to make such a declaration, but sort of in the totality of this H2Ohio Wetlands project, how long before it's online and fully functioning? My sense is it's not in its infancy, but it's still in early stages, and it wouldn't be expected to be fully effective for a while yet.
So I want to say Brooks Park was one of the first wetlands to be completed in terms of construction and planting, and that was in summer of 2021. And we still have a lot of wetlands that are coming online where groundbreaking hasn't even happened yet. So the collective impact of them, you know, wetlands also need time for plants to grow up and do their thing. And it takes at least a year for the vegetation to come in and establish itself, especially if you're not willing to go out and hand plant 40,000 plants. You know, it might take a little longer. So the fact that our wetlands are already providing such ecosystem services in their infancy, I think is really promising. But no, I don't think we'll see the collective impact of it for a few more years, because there are so many projects that, like I said, haven't even started yet. So. Yeah.
So what was it about the construction process that increased the phosphorus absorption capacity? Do they add absorbing materials, or is it just exposing new soil?
No, I think it's mostly taking off the topsoil. That was, the soil fertility was so degraded, right? So they literally just removed all the soil that, because I mean, it's what, 12 feet down from where it was, right, in the bottom of some of those pools now. So what we're able to sample is just different from the little plugs we were pulling off the very top.
Thanks for this talk. At the beginning, you showed us a number of different types of wetlands, and it seemed like the ones that were closer to the lake maybe had more complicating hydrology. I can imagine how tough that is. From a nutrients and load reduction standpoint, how do you think you could prioritize investing in wetlands, you know, upstream versus downstream, from what we know?
So, I mean, that's a question that our monitoring program as a whole is really trying to answer. And this is maybe the first year where we even have enough metadata to put that together to try to answer some of those questions. I think we're also just still getting a handle on how to deal with some of the floodplain and off-channel wetlands now that we finally have like a year of water volume data. But they do look like they're doing a pretty decent job. And so I think it's going to take putting together the numbers to really figure that out. But so far, I would say that the flow-through wetlands and the floodplain wetlands are looking pretty good. And maybe the jury's still out on the other two. Yeah, I think she's checking.
Question online, Margaret?
A couple.
Okay.
Okay, so for GLWM wetland, are you measuring DOP as well? If so, how is DOP responding to wetland construction?
We are not measuring dissolved organic phosphate, if that's the question. We're not measuring that separately. We're measuring soluble reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus.
Thank you. Next one is, will you or are you be looking at the measured changes in nutrient loads in relation to observed algae blooms?
I'm assuming that this person is referring to the impact on it, or impact on algae blooms. That's my interpretation of the question. And like I said, in Grand Lake, at least from the pre-H2Ohio wetlands, from the older wetlands, and many other management practices, you know, we can already see the cumulative effect in the lake. I'm sure that when we are able to fully calculate loads for multiple years in a row, we can make an estimate towards how that might be reducing nutrients into Lake Erie and other, you know, probably the Ohio River too, but we're not quite there yet.
Thanks. One more. With wetlands being the primary method for reducing nutrients going into Ohio's waters, do you think there is a concern for the degradation of these wetlands? If so, do you see any validity in H2Ohio implementing low impact development strategies, rain gardens, bioswales, etc.? You mentioned vegetation as being a key part of wetland success, and I think LIDs might preserve the longevity of wetlands by adding plant power? Should I say that again?
Well, I mean, I first want to say the wetlands aren't necessarily the main tool that the state of Ohio is using. There are many, many mitigation and management practices that are funded by and part of H2Ohio. And the budget for the wetlands is a small component of the entire thing. It's an important component, and I'm biased and think that because I'm working on them. But there are many levers that the state of Ohio is pushing to try to work on nutrient reduction. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure I followed the rest of it.
All right, so should I read it again? Do you want me to start on the second part?
Sure.
Okay. So the first part, with wetlands being the primary method for reducing nutrients, you mentioned this. Do you think there's a concern for the degradation of these wetlands?
Well, so again, it's not the primary method, but I believe that, continued monitoring and trying to create better management tools to make sure that there is the ability to continue promoting these wetlands as nutrient reduction tools, right? Like going in and being able to dredge out an initial settling pond will help over time to make these wetlands continue to be nutrient reduction, effective at nutrient reduction.
And the next part is, do you see any validity in H2Ohio implementing low impact development strategies such as rain gardens, bioswales, et cetera?
Well, I'm not sure that H2Ohio funds those things. I could be wrong and I'm not certain, but I believe that they've been functioning on sort of a more meta level of trying to, get farmers to enact certain management practices across a watershed, et cetera, sort of targeting the things that might be most effective in a given watershed. So I think there is validity in doing those things. I'm not sure that they are part of the H2Ohio funding as it stands.
And the second part was just a statement about vegetation being a key part of wetland success.
Yeah.
But we did get another question. Shay, did you have a question? Okay. So does the plant species have an impact on nutrient reduction?
Excellent question. And that is what Bill's model was showing. I don't think he really got into the part next week. That's one of the things that we're trying to look at, because Bill's model predicts that invasive plants like typha actually really reduce the wetland's ability to, for example, remove nitrogen. And so we have an awesome plant team at Bowling Green, and we're hoping that in working with them and, trying to tune this model, if we get funding for it, to the H2Ohio wetlands, we'll be able to answer questions like that in practice in Ohio.
And the second part is, are all H2Ohio constructed wetlands having the same plant species?
I only know the ones I'm working on, so I'm not sure. Plus there are like 170 of them, and I know about like 24. So I would say the same range of things, because we're trying to plant native wetland plants across, a middle swath of Ohio, which is pretty similar. But I actually don't know. I'm sorry, but plants are not my area of expertise, and so I'm not entirely sure how that differs from what might be native along the shore of Lake Erie, for example.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you all again for attending, and let's thank Silvia one more time.